would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker of this evening, which I have the pleasure to introduce. We invited her last year in Barcelona because when we knew that the conference would be here, we really wanted her to be one of the keynote speakers. She couldn't stop crying because she was so happy about it. Well, she's not only a designer, a writer, a teacher, a typographer, but she likes to call herself, not only to call herself, but she really likes the word pesquisadora, which is researcher. And just the fact that she really loves this word in Portuguese also represents something about her and being in Brazil for a while. I think sometimes she's more Brazilian than I am. So please come to the stage, Catherine Dixon.
Obrigada. Então, de volta. De volta na cidade que eu amo mais no mundo, desculpa Rio, mas é verdade. Estou muito feliz de ficar em Sampa mais uma vez. Estou muito orgulhosa também de apresentar uma palestra nessa conferência aqui. Na verdade, o ano passado, em Barcelona, quando Marina me convidou a participar, comecei a chorar, é verdade. Então, obrigada a ATypI, Marina, Cláudio, Diego, Cris, Henrique e todas as pessoas que sonharam com esse evento e, mais importante, que contribuíram na realização deste evento. Parabéns. Mas desculpem. Ainda não consigo apresentar tudo em português. O meu português piorou muito quando voltei para Londres, claro. Então tenho que falar em inglês, mas prometo, vou tentar falar devagar. We'll see. A Catarina Britânica. And I'm really sorry because it would appear that I've brought the British weather with me to this auditorium. It's kind of chilly in here. Challenges, such a great theme for a conference. And then you sit down to think about what on earth you're going to say, and the possibilities are kind of so endless, you just think, oh gosh, where am I going to begin? So this is really a talk with some musings and threads of mine in recent months, things that have kind of unsettled me really a little bit. And I have to say this talk has taken a little while to kind of pin down, and if I'm really honest, I think it's still wriggling a little bit. So we'll see. So I just thought I'd say what I do, what I am bringing to this consideration of typographic challenges. So I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, and I'm also a designer. So this is a book cover I designed for Penguin 10 years ago now. I was also a visiting professor for the University of São Paulo for 1 year between 2011 and 2012, and it was my great privilege to consider this country to be my home for a year. And there were lots of moments like this. It was great. And so, the title of the talk, Mas tudo bem, In Search of Typographic Optimism. I said that it was a talk where I'm really thinking about challenges in terms of some of the things that have unsettled me. But the problem with talking about challenges is that it can all get a bit gloomy. So I wanted to try to find the positive in the mix. And this is a great Brazilian expression. You could say, o mundo vai acabar. Well, mas tudo bem. Like, the world's going to end. But that's okay. So it's eternally optimistic, and I really caught it. So I say it a lot back in England. So it's a really great Brazilian expression. And then, because I suddenly thought, I'm going to use it in a lecture title, I should just make sure it doesn't have any other weird meaning. So I did a Google search, and actually what it did was it brought up the lyrics to Nirvana's Lithium. But that's okay. So I guess if there's a soundtrack to this lecture, it's that. So I might be a little bit nervous, but hopefully I'm not going to break. So, note to self, breathe. Okay, so this talk and its wrigglingness. Oh, sorry, that's horrible for the translators. I'm sorry. These are kind of keywords. Workmanship, I'll come back to all of them. Articulation, value, relevance, history, community, preciousness. And it's really interesting, having just been in the group discussion that Indra just led really brilliantly, that actually some of this was coming up in that discussion, which is always encouraging. It's a keynote. It's the start of an event. I want to open up territory, so I don't have all the answers, and mostly questions. There will be bullet points. Don't believe the bullet points. This was a really great paper I read about how PowerPoint is killing our ability to think properly. Really the proper beginning. So I should probably press the timer, yeah. Workmanship. An interesting word. It's taken a while to find. It comes from a book by ATypI, The Nature and Art of Workmanship. It was written back in 1968. It's still widely regarded to be a small masterpiece, and it still has an incredible amount of resonance. Of course, there's a really immediate problem with gender bias, workmanship. But I'm really not going down the whole route of trying to say workwomanship, not least because it's really hard. And workpersonship is just problematic. So we'll just take it as read that there's a gender bias implicit in the term, but it took such a lot of finding this term, I was reluctant to let it go. So what do I mean? Well, ATypI says design is what, for practical purposes, can be conveyed in words and in drawing. Workmanship is what, for practical purposes, cannot. So it's about execution, it's about production, it's about how things are done. No, actually, I've put, these are drawings by Miles Newlin for his typeface missionary underneath this text, because it suddenly made me think, actually, that the role of drawing in typeface design in relation to production and specification and production is quite interesting, because it doesn't really fit into these sort of methodological compartments so easily. But this idea of how things are done is key. Why not craftsmanship? Now, the whole idea of the word craft is so problematic and so loaded and so, we just think knitting and macrame and strange things. And ATypI just said it's a word to start an argument with, so it's a good reason to not go there. So what he does, his great contribution is that he really kind of gets away from the word craft altogether, and he talks about two kinds of workmanship. He talks about the workmanship of risk. Here, the idea is that you don't quite know how it's going to end out when you start, and it could go wrong or go brilliantly at any moment. So the work is continually at risk as you're making it. And then there's the workmanship of certainty, which is what you find in kind of quantity production or mass production. So you know exactly from a given moment in the process how it's going to end up. So the distinction is, once it's gone into production, is there any doubt about the outcome? That's sort of what distinguishes between the two. What he says, interestingly, is there's not a qualitative distinction. It's not that handmade is always best. Lord knows, we've all probably got some horrible handmade things at home that people have given us, that we love them and we have to keep them. But there's the idea, but there is a sort of emphasis on quality, a kind of a richness, a sort of materiality often in the handmade. And the certainty tends to be about the new and the innovative. So they kind of have a different kind of emphasis. But one is not essentially better or worse than the other. So from thinking about this idea of workmanship and how things are done, we think about articulation. So the difficulty of articulating what workmanship is in typography. And really the problem of invisibility. So an example from this year. Penguin, iconic British publisher, founded in the 1930s, decided to produce on their 80th birthday a series of small books. Very low budget, they cost 80 pence, 80 of them, 80th year. You can kind of see where they were going. And the problem with them is that they're horrible. I really wanted to like them, but they're really rather horrible. So here they are in my little hands, so you can get the scale. And here are a couple of them from online. So the idea is simple, pared down typography. There is no balance to them. They are clumsy. They just feel very heavy-handed. These are the posters for them. So the one on the left, that's not a proper ellipsis. That's 3 full stops that are vaguely having something to do with each other, but the spacing between them is so bad. So this is supposed to look kind of beautiful and elegant, and it just looks very clunky. That's not good for the translators either. Heavy. I have a very idiosyncratic vocabulary in English often, so I'm a nightmare to translate. So what do we learn? We learn that seemingly simple, effortless typography is not effortless at all. This would be the counterpoint. This is David Pearson's Penguin Popular Classics. Now, these were budget. These are both budget things. It's not like I'm putting high-end against budget. These were produced at £2 each, mass production. They are light, they are elegant, they have an awareness of space, there's a sensitivity. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, this kind of, you know it when you've got it, but how do you articulate workmanship? So it's not that I'm advocating classicism, nor do I want to poke fun, actually, or laugh at the kind of bad ones. This is just about this problem of identifying workmanship and the problem of kind of recognising its value. And by value, I realised in the last discussion, I don't mean monetary value. I mean sense of worth, not a financial value. And how to value what you can't see, and what are the implications of how to value what things that you can't see. So the first is a loss of richness. David Pye says, unless workmanship comes to be understood and appreciated for the art it is, our environment will lose much of the quality it still retains. So there's a kind of qualitative argument for richness, which is connected to a wider sort of maker illiteracy. And again, this has a lot of relevance for the discussion we were just having about the type market, a complete lack of understanding of where things have come from. So this is a great quote from a lovely essay called Hand and Brain, which was produced by a friend of mine, a series of digital essays. Consumers need to understand an object's context of production, embedded skills and knowledge, quality of materials, its complexity, so that they can develop an understanding of how and why similar things might be differently valued. And she goes on to say, and this is really relevant in terms of the market, the digital playing field can make life appear more level than it really is. I'm not convinced that this contextual flattening at a reductive visual junction, i.e. the screen, is entirely positive for those trying to earn a living through their making. And I think what we just learned from the discussion, for those trying to make their living selling type too. And how to value what you can't see. And this is a tweet that Toshi tweeted this morning, because I couldn't sleep, obviously, because of giving this talk, so I was looking on Twitter. But this idea, we must all, as designers, those of us that are practicing designers, have been put in the position whereby you are given the most ludicrous deadline for a project, which is a complete undervaluing of what it is that needs to happen. So here Toshi just said, yeah, they only give you 2 months to do this job, and that's really typical of what's happening in design circles now, complete undervaluing of how long and how things should be done. And then this, which is really worse, a kind of fashionable idea called disruption. And this is just a horrifying story about a machine, a piece of software that uses machine creativity to create graphic art. Because it costs 60% of the cost of video games comes from the artwork. So when the interviewer said, so you're putting artists out of work? No, we're enabling video games companies to create more and better games at our expense. And I have to say that the design press isn't immune from such undervaluing too. So where you might look for some kind of reinforcement, hooray, for us, no. So this happened. Fiona Banner, great British artist, very fond of her, and actually some of her work is spectacular. So she decided that she was going to create a mash-up typeface. Okay. Here it is in Creative Review. My actually problem's not with Fiona Banner here. The write-up, it's Creative Review. So here they're talking about it very matter-of-factly. And then there's this great quote, and while a little ugly, Type purists will no doubt balk at it. It is surprisingly legible. You can download it here. And I wasn't really upset by the typeface. I was really upset by this idea that type purists might be a little bit upset. Oh, silly us for having explored some of this territory before, with expertise in the making of such things. And here, in this little line, we're just reduced to being fussy twits. This work has precedent, and of its kind, it's not very good. But it didn't say anything. It made no reference to contextualizing the work or saying, well, as an artist, we've done this before. There was nothing about that. We were just fussy. So I often have quite odd visual images come into my head, and I just kind of thought, oh God, is this what's happening? This is like, typography is like those little frilly mats that your granny puts on the sofa, or my granny used to, certainly. So in English, they're called antimacassars, which is a great word. So you to stop dirty things happening on the chair. And I thought, well, is this what typography and the kind of this typographic sensibility is being seen as? The world of typography is like a ghetto for obsessive-compulsive disorder purists. So, now in terms of the design press, there's a wider problem with critique. There's a wider problem that's been much written about, the value of the expert critic. Now everyone's a critic. The problems of critiquing mass culture with the values of aesthetic values from the past. And then this is very lovely. This is Bruno Latour. And he says, with so much destruction in our world already, is it really the task of the humanities to add deconstruction to destruction? Like, life's hard enough. Let's not go there. Let's just say everything's lovely. So that's kind of some of the things that had bothered me and unsettled me a little bit. So the word here is probably, if I was giving a proper fancy research paper, I'd probably have to say paradigm shifts, but I hate the word paradigm shift so much, so we've gone with Bob Dylan instead. Things and the times are always a-changing. So how have things got to the way that they are now? Well, there's a contemporary worship of the idea and innovation. Now, I have very real, quite fraught arguments with senior art directors in branding, many of whom I was at college with, and then when we get together, they're talking about their businesses and what they do. And they are forever saying about what I do, well, Catherine, the person that they're appealing to on the streets with their brands, they don't care about typographic finesse, so why should they have to take on any of it in terms of their projects? It's the idea that matters, not the execution. So I can name, well, I won't, a couple of brands in London where actually the lettering is drawn, it's wrong. I can spot it at like 100 feet. The letters are the wrong shape because the person who's executed them says, oh, yeah, well, it doesn't matter. It's the idea. There's a shift in education towards generalism. Now, it's quite interesting to say this and have this make this point here in Brazil because there's a very different model for how art schools and design operates in the UK and in Brazil. So, but this idea of specialism in education giving way to a kind of generalism. So the idea that design thinking is transferable, that's the most important thing. A little bit like, the idea, but the thinking can go across the disciplines. And actually it's this kind of reflexivity that matters rather than just discipline-specific skills. So this was Stuart Bailey writing in 2006, 2007 for Parsons School of Design, where they were reimagining what a design curriculum might be. It's quite interesting that he's since recapitulated a little bit and gone, oh, well, I didn't mean you don't do them. I just mean that, that they go with something else, which is fine. It's just that most people I know are photocopying this particular paper and not the second one. And there is a danger, in English we would say that the baby is going to get thrown out with the bathwater. Lord knows how you're going to translate that into Brazil. But the kind of some important stuff is going to go as well. There's also this argument towards a dematerialization of design. So this is thinking about sustainability issues and thinking, why are we making things objects. We should be, as designers, we should be creating systems for people, and we shouldn't be distracted by material artifacts, paper, books, these kinds of things. So this is thinking about this human context of the design problem, so an approach which is really focused on that. We should be thinking about the design of immaterial services, such as hospital or school bureaucracies. And then there's a shift from print to networked media, and the notion of mediocrity. Now, a friend posted this on Facebook, and I nearly fell over when I read. So there's a comparison for people talking about their background in print to people talking about their online or kind of networked media models or paradigms. And it talks about the print people, their process, which is built on hard-earned, expensive and rare expertise, and the digital paradigm, which is admittedly mediocre, but is consistently mediocre and predictable, and as time goes by, needs less and less skill to operate it, which is like saying, well, yeah, it's a bit shit, but it's consistently shit, so that's okay. Yeah. So, what would I say in response to these four things? Well, about this contemporary worship of the idea at the expense of the execution, I would have to say that I'm really bored of these lowest common denominator arguments, and I don't think they really hold much water or much credence. There are lots of things that we can get away with, but should we? Hell no. So this is when Richard Sennett writes about craft, he talks about the desire to do a job well for its own sake. And again, one of my weird visual analogies, and I was thinking about the things that we get away with. Well, in Europe, we got ourselves in a little bit of a mess by the things we thought we could get away with putting in meat products. So making burgers, beef burgers, which were made out of horse meat. So there was a big scandal about this, and everyone was really indignant, but they'd been eating them quite happily. They were oblivious. They didn't know. So the argument of, well, the person in the street, it doesn't matter if the typography isn't amazing. What do they know? Well, they were eating beef burgers that were full of horse meat, and they didn't know, and they were quite happy. And then it was broken as a scandal, and then everyone said, oh, but you've got to do things properly. Yes, you should. And let's not even get started with the stuff that they found in the IKEA chocolate almond tart that they had to very quickly withdraw from the market. And this idea, the contemporary worship of innovation at the expense of tradition. So design is David Pye again talks about design being very difficult to learn now, simply because the arts, typo there, are in a state of flux. Everyone is so invested in innovation that the tradition and ongoing kind of building up of things is being neglected at the expense of that. But I think probably the category that I am most concerned by is this kind of dematerialist emphasis on human context. I think it's really interesting because I think it's at the expense of opportunities to address just that. Again, Twitter, my friend. When you've got all these ideas going around your head, it's amazing what kind of drops in. And the Petter van Blokland just put this, and that was great. Where does the thinking of designers come from? That design can be made entirely by thinking in their heads and then solve the world's problems. So this idea that, yes, no, we don't have to engage with making things and it's all about thinking about systems. He's just thinking, no, we have to engage with stuff and material and work things through. It's messier than that. It's not just about design thinking. And then this is a shed catalogue from the 1950s from England. Now, in England, we have these sheds, often in gardens for those people who have little gardens in the backs of their houses. We tend to put garden furniture, maybe some things that we do the gardening with, tools. Sometimes people go and spend quite a lot of time in them. They're a little mini retreat. But we're very fond as a culture of sheds. So this is a catalogue full of sheds. There are pages of them. They've all got a name, and they have a little bit of description and a picture, very important. And then then you have all of them different measurements, so you can work out which is exactly going to fit in your garden. Now, I love this shed catalogue, and I talk to my first-year students quite a lot about this shed catalogue, because shed catalogues actually are the kinds of things that make our lives better, if you like sheds. It's the kind of day-to-day typography that makes a difference to just day-to-day life. And it's the kind of stuff that is generally massively overlooked. So kind of getting this to look very effective, to be very clear, is much harder. Again, the problem of invisibility. So Paul Stiff writes about this, and he kind of quotes the typographic working party from the 60s, again 1968, like David Pye. Many unspectacular areas of design which play an important part in our lives are either not designed at all or are designed badly. And so then Bridget Wilkins lists some examples of things, catalogues, price lists, food and medicine labels, dictionaries, these kinds of things. And this is a quote, unexpectedly, which again jumped into my world of reference. It's Joseph Roth, and he's writing about France in the 20s and 30s, and he was writing about Marseille. I'd been doing some reading about the city of Marseille. And he talks, this is very specific to Marseille, but there was something from it which I used as a departure point. So Marseille is a world in which adventure is commonplace, and the commonplace is adventurous. And I think one of the challenges in typography now is to make the commonplace adventurous again, to make it a territory and a space where designers want to work and want to occupy and want to kind of, to make exciting again, rather than to just reject it. So this is back to this idea of value. You know, shed catalogues aren't the sexiest things in the world. Well, maybe to some people they are. But this isn't where we give prizes for great design. So this is kind of another problem of this sort of invisibility, invisible projects, and opportunities to address actually really quite real human contexts are missed. So everyone's talking about, yes, we have to move forward and we have to think about design thinking and reject, we don't need typography. And actually, in typography, there are all these opportunities for actually working with very real, very human contexts. So I would, rather than there being the most beautiful, there's lots of most beautiful books, the most beautiful British books, they're not normally that beautiful, the most beautiful Swiss books, they generally are, the most beautiful Dutch books, lots of beautiful books. I think there should be the most beautiful gas bills award. These kinds of things are kind of attributing sort of credit to things that would actually really help, given very low literacy levels and declining literacy levels, particularly in the UK. This is Norman Potter. It is not difficult to be personally creative while culturally inconsequential. So this is this is where typography as personal expression has kind of overtaken. All of my students are horrified if they actually have to use existing content. They all want to write the stuff as well as to design it. But a project that I think has been really inspiring for me is the Murti Indian Classical Library for Harvard University Press. So this is a project where, due to the most extraordinary generosity of a New York from India businessman, they are able to publish sort of 3,000 years worth of Indian literature. Now, I was lucky enough to go to the launch at the Indian Embassy in London, where I heard the scholars talking about what it meant to them to be able to bring texts which are locked in particular scripts, particular manuscripts, and unable to be disseminated across the whole continent of India, which is extraordinarily complex in terms of the numbers of scripts that people speak. So people in different parts of India don't have access to their canon of scholarship, including mathematics, language, philosophy, literature. And one of my colleagues is from Chennai, and she said that when she was at school, she studied Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, but she wasn't able to have access to the same canon of literature from her own home country. So it's a project which takes, has some scholars working and selecting the texts, and then they're dual language, so they're in English, but they're with the original script. Now, some of the formats, because they've been passed down orally, or they're just in manuscript form, they don't have typefaces for them. So there's been a fantastic project, Fiona Ross has been key, John Hodson, Tyro, to develop scripts, Titus as well, develop scripts and to be able to publish this literature. And hearing the scholars speak about what this meant, and I think this is a 99-year project. Yeah, so this is like really thinking ahead. So the designers are thinking about transferring and thinking about handing over templates for people in generations to be able to continue this publishing project. So for me, this is human context. This is design which is culturally consequential. And it was just an extraordinary opportunity to hear about a project like this which had such resonance and such significance. And it's really typography and design at its very, very best. And if we think about these arguments about the shift from print to networked media and this idea of embracing mediocrity, there has always been mediocrity. There was no golden age where everything was lovely. There has always been mediocrity. But should we limit our ambition? And David Pye, why do we accept this as inevitable? We made it so, and we can unmake it. And this is William Gibson. The future will resent us in exact proportion to our failure to have attempted to meaningfully address those systematic problems that we will be known to have been quite aware of. So, and what are we doing? Nostalgia. Now, some of you may be familiar with a terrible British detective series called Midsummer Murder. It's quite old now. It involves a lot of people drinking a lot of tea and drinking sandwiches, getting murdered quite a lot. And I'm using it as an illustration to another really big challenge in typography is our attitude to history. So this is great. This episode, it's not supposed to be a comedy, but I really laughed because he's killed with a printing press. Like you've never seen. So in the background, the man with the tie is a very concerned detective, and the man in the front with his little hands up is the victim, the poor victim. So this printing press, somehow the body, we're supposed to believe that the body has gone in and that this timber has come down and there's been enough pressure to kill this man. So obviously he's a bit bigger than ATypI. So this is impossible. But also, for this to have worked and for the body to be there with the lines of type across from the printing ink that was still on the type was in the air, not on the bed. There's not ever a printing press in the world where the type is in the air that comes down on top. And he was also murdered with, 300-point type? Because obviously that makes much better television to have the stripes going across the body. So it was a moment of high drama, but it's one of the funniest things I've seen in a long while. So our approach to history. This is a great story. This kind of, a bit like the Murty Indian Classic Library, this really gives me hope. So this is Rob Green, and this story broke right at the end of last year. And actually, last night, he gave the Beatrice Ward Memorial Lecture in London about the story of diving into the River Thames to retrieve the Dove's Press type. The Dove's Press was an early 20th century private press. There was a falling out, I'm going to summarise, a falling out between the owners, and one of them, over a period of some months, threw the type off of the bridge into the River Thames. And there's been a lot written about this, and Rob Greene decided to not accept received wisdom that it must have gone, and he went and looked for it, and he found it. So he worked with a team of divers. He actually did his research before that. He read everything. He read all of the correspondence. He read all of the notes. He worked out from the descriptions where on the bridge the person must have been stood. He looked at tides. He looked at the shape of the bridge. They did some research. They looked at, and they worked out when the lowest tide levels would be, and then they got a diving crew. And he, lo and behold, he dragged this stuff up. So I like this because it's not playing fast and loose with history, making it up. It's also not accepting what we think is established and going and challenging it and going, well, I wonder. And actually, he's gone and proved everybody wrong, and he's gone and found the stuff. So people that have heard me speak before know that I have a pet hate of nostalgia. It's something I've spoken about quite a lot, especially in relation to letterpress. And I've spoken about the negativity by praising those who I think are really working between the obvious limitations of kind of retro, vintage stuff. So one of those projects I've spoken about is Sheila Siaza, Project Akaya, which is here in Sao Paulo, which is using letterpress with teenage kids to help them evidence that they've got something to say to their community by putting a printing press in their hands. And then the other guys that I've spoken a lot about are L'Automatica, who work in Barcelona. And they use a printing press in a very political way, so they kind of communicate with their local community. So they are, going back to the idea of content and not finding something Gandhi once said or John Lennon and kind of setting it in a bit of wood type and trying to sell it at a flea market. But the idea of really trying to think about what a printing press can do. Now, nostalgia for some isn't necessarily a dead end. This desire for the past draws our attention to something that we've lost. So it's a kind of resistance to the act of losing it. And it allows us, apparently, to see what's wrong with the world. There is a value in tradition, but it can be a trap too. And nostalgia is kind of, this William Gibson again, is the deadliest enemy, really, of history. This idea of fetishizing craftsmanship, making status objects, becomes kind of the opposite of what was intended. But it is where the value comes of archives. And I think people often think that archives are of value because of the history they tell us. No, they're not. They're valuable because of the histories they're going to tell us, because they are the resource for re-examining the existing inadequate, mostly, histories that we do have and the assumptions that we go back to and we recycle all the time. They reconnect us to voices from the past. There's a humility in discovering we are not the great innovators we think we are, and that actually generally people had done something kind of before. So it's what they've got to tell us yet, and the fact that we can go digging about in them, a bit like Rob Greene digging about in the Thames and coming up with the Dove's Press. And here I just wanted to say something about St Bride, because some people will know that I have had quite a strong connection with the printing library in London, which is in distinct trouble right now. And there's not very much news coming out, and all I wanted to say was to use this platform was to say, bear with us, because some of us are quite frustrated about that and are trying to do something about that. So there should be news. So those of you who've just given up on it as a lost cause, hold on, and we'll get back to you. And voices. Sorry, Indra. This is a kind of a bit like archives. This is something Indra's talked about online, but those kind of bits on the ATypI discussion list where people start reminiscing and talking about things, but genuinely great stuff is in that that comes out. It's not the kind of stuff that academic researchers are necessarily looking at. This kind of goes back to the very first presentation this morning that Claire Claire and Mary-Anne were talking about, the sort of split, but there's some really great stuff. So this idea of talking and hearing people's stories and the value of that kind of law and what that tells us about the past too, really, the proper past. And that kind of connects to community. Now here, I think the distinction is where we start to think about, this is trying to think about why we do what we do. And it's about the difference between what I would call value, and the need to, we've established we need to value what we do, and preciousness. Now, preciousness is when we value it, but we want to hold it close. And we kind of go, okay, well, this is ours. You know, it's very important, but it's ours. And in English, we talk a little bit about being very precious about things. It's never normally a very positive thing. It means that there's a barrier to engagement with other people. There are plenty of disconnects, and we just tapped into a few of them in that discussion in the other room. The whole software user interface thing, and that's great because Eve's going to talk to us later in the conference about that. The whole Euler-Schmuler thing that we were kind of looking at just now. All sorts of stuff about terminologies. Why pro means one thing here and it means another thing here. There's a lot of stuff like this, a disconnect between what we're doing and users. Now, I'm somebody that knows something about type, and a number of phone calls that I get from colleagues, art directors, who go, okay, well, I need this. I need to update this. Can you tell me what version I should buy of the font? And I go and look online, and I'm like, oh, well, how long have you got? Before the meeting with the executive finance director, and they'll say, like 15 minutes. I'm like, damn, because if you'd had an hour, I could have probably worked that out. So just kind of overly, unnecessarily complex and inconsistent things that really, really mean it can be really hard for designers that don't know the latest thing about the type community to just even be able to kind of keep up with. And we can be a little bit kind of ivory towers about our knowledge. Even a couple of weeks ago, I was at a presentation, and one of the type designers went, oh yeah, and to stop the silly designers getting it wrong, we've done this. I was like, what? The silly designers who can't use your typeface properly. Well, there's a two-way thing there in terms of how we think about functionality. Now, this stuff is tricky. In terms of who's designing, where they're designing, how they're designing. For both those with design experience and without. So my experience is of working with people who know about design, but actually the complexities of some contemporary typeface functionality kind of leaves them cold. So this was something that Lawrence Penny posted, where the open type features really out of control. Oh, those poor people at their poor summer parties, or whatever those are. And then we all kind of had a laugh, and oh gosh. And I thought this was a screen, actually. I thought this was a digital screen, and then I realised it's actually a massive sign outside a hotel, quite a nice hotel as well, that's actually been made. So we can all go, oh, duh. But actually, I think the more valid thing to do here is, rather than kind of laugh at this, is to think about, well, how did this happen, and why did this happen? And what can we do to make it not happen again? So with all of this, this is about education, and it's about investment. Now, Stanley Morrison, Beatrice too, was able to sell a lot of typefaces to new markets because he educated them into why on earth they might need them in the first place. And the investment made by Monotype and Linotype through the Monotype newsletter, the Linotype newsletter, all of them, endless publications, educational leaflets being disseminated to printers, the people they wanted to buy things. Why? In fact, giving them reasons to buy it. You know, if you've got Bembo, you've got Bembo, but you need Bodoni too. Well, why do I need Bodoni? Well, because. So there's a whole dialogue in terms of education and investment, which is to help the silly designers actually be able to use the typefaces properly. So there should be this kind of relationship. And when you look at the investment and that relationship in the past, we don't have anything close to it, because now the implication is that the education should be happening in the universities or in the art schools, whereas before it was all happening within the market and in the trade. And I have to tell you, as somebody that works in full-time education, there is no way that you're even going to get close to being able to cover this in a kind of contemporary curriculum. And my own work really is very much, although I'm like Little Miss Classification, it's not a word I really ever use to describe my own work. I prefer description, and I'm really interested in frameworks for engagement, so giving people tools with which they can start to unpack and understand things for themselves, rather than me saying this is a this, this is a this, this is a this. It's about giving people kind of vocabularies of access, understanding typeface shapes through history particularly, but being able to read forms and understand what's going on. So thinking back to our kind of irrelevance and our kind of jibes of us as being type purists, this sense of preciousness, I can't help but feel, is adding to that. So is it time to start communicating value more through education, to share so that we actually might be heard and better valued, and to share our communities perhaps a little bit better too? So, diversity. In my talk blurb, it said I was going to mention something called retro-sexism. And Phil Baines, who I teach with, said, what on earth is retro-sexism? And I said, it's this thing that happens when, as a woman, you're reading online discussion chats over the summer and you suddenly think you're in the 1970s. And I was in the 1970s, but fortunately I was too small to remember most of the awful stuff about it. So a kind of a blip. Is it become fashionable to be sexist again? But, you know, if somebody on an online discussion group says, oh, you know, it's quite intimidating as a woman to be in this space, and the reaction that they get is, well, tell us what's intimidating about that, because unless we know what's intimidating about that, we can't do anything about how you're intimidated. And if you don't understand what's intimidating about that, it's really quite hard to know what to say. So kind of efforts to try to work with diversity, even within our existing communities, showing some kind of quite unfortunate and unpleasant cracks which emerged over the summer. If there's one good thing to have come out of all of that, it's alphabets. It's also a really nice opportunity to show off Laura Mezeguet's magazine typeface in a presentation. And what's also really nice about this is it doesn't wear its kind of women's label too. You know, Alphabets is a showcase for work, commentary, and research on lettering, typography, and type design. Now, a part of me kind of thinks it's such a pity that this has to exist. I understand why it exists, and I'm completely behind it. But on another level, a part of me thinks it's a real pity that this has to exist. Why isn't there just an integrated platform? Why are we having these issues with sexism and kind of problems over diversity? It's worth unpacking, and it was really encouraging to hear that at the conferences over the summer that there was a lot of workshopping around some of these ideas. But I feel always a little bit uncomfortable when we end up with these kind of women's only environments and kind of that have to be separated. Because I also think that there's some very complicated ideas around supporting women as a woman. And actually, when all of these discussions were happening, I was thinking about a scenario of a printing organisation that I've been a member of for a long time that has a lot of much, much older, generally male people. Now, I'm very gender blind. It kind of gets me into all sorts of troubles, but I'm just generally chattering about something and I'm not really thinking about anything. And I've just been in that organisation for ages. But more latterly, there's been some behaviour in that organisation that's been really uncomfortable. And I, particularly for one of my younger female colleagues, has really suffered. And then I kind of looked back and I thought, well, how much have I been complicit in kind of dodging that or not confronting that? And actually she's now really suffering because maybe I should have been more explicit. And then I thought about, there were a couple of times when I thought about saying something and I've looked at the older women who are really quite terrifying. And then I thought, well, actually, there's something quite complex happening here. It's just not a men and women thing. It's about everybody thinking about their roles and their responsibilities in encouraging diversity. So my students over the summer set up this project called Sisterhood. And the idea was just, to think about something that you could do every day, which was to encourage women in their work. What I really liked about it is that when they launched it, men could become sisters as well. So it wasn't just this kind of separation and making these separate spaces. And then there comes this idea of actually, are these gender-based issues, or are they just ego-based? And this idea of, it's not rocket science to say to people, you should probably shut up and listen as much as you speak, but it does seem to be something that some people seem to have trouble with. But this idea, if we are a community, we should be a reflexive community, looking to learn from each other, not always to be asserting. Oh yeah, look, that wobbles. So, everyone needs a drink, not least me. How things are done matters, as well as why they are done. Yes, the why matters too, but how? Typography is not, obviously, the be-all and end-all of the world, but its workmanship is not to be underrated, and it's not as easy as it looks. Google logo discussion, there you go. It's not as easy as it looks. Paradigm shift, it's what they do. But we need to stay relevant. This is an extraordinary quote from Eric Hobsbawm. And he's talking about, he's quoting Paul Klee. It says Paul Klee writing about the Bauhaus in the 20s. And he says, we don't have the support of a people, but we are looking for a people. That is how we began over there at the Bauhaus. We started with a community to which we gave all we had. We can't do more than that. And it wasn't enough. Being relevant and being connected to the communities that are working with type, the books, the things that we're making matters. I think we need to stop this departure to planet typography. All I could think about was Battlestar Galactica, when they kind of leave the Earth and they go off as a fleet of kind of like big foundries, little foundries. Everyone just kind of leaving the rest of graphic design behind, going, they don't know what they're doing. We're just going. And if we want typographic improvement, we have to equip a wider circle of people. And we have to create spaces for sharing more effectively. So sharing value without the preciousness. So yes, this matters, this is ours, it's not mine, ours, and you don't know what you're doing. Or maybe it's a better kind of preciousness. So this is a very long quote from Bruno Latour. So Bruno Latour is writing about Critic, and why has Critic run out of steam? And he's reimagining the role of a critic. The critic is not the one who debunks, but the one who assembles. The critic is not the one who lifts the rugs from under the feet of the naive believers, but the one who offers the participants arenas in which to gather. How often do we on Twitter go, ha ha ha, the silly people don't know what they're doing. They're the feet of the naive believers, but it's about trying to share. And then, just to finish, conference is not spectacle most of the time. I should say thank you to Eve for letting me use that. It's about conferring and it's about community. So what I'm trying to say is the success of this conference doesn't depend on the people presenting, thank goodness. It's the collective. That's what makes a conference. Yes, we're here to celebrate achievements within that community, but beyond that, we need to reflect on who else might become a part of this community. And then, one very last word of Gringa advice for this conference. Sao Paulo is described in the New York Times as being the ugliest, most dangerous city you'll ever love. So, I wish you all a very good conference, but please do go fall in love.